Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I have a topic I've been wanting to talk about ever since I thought about starting a podcast. I'm like, this is the topic I want to talk about. It's something that was a light bulb moment for me, and I'm like, everyone needs to recognize this and understand this. So first of all, hopefully you guys can hear me okay. This podcast, or rather this mic that I have, it's very sensitive. So I actually have to get I think it's called a pop filter or something. So I'm going to get that soon. So hopefully you guys can still hear me. It's not a big deal, but I want to dive into this topic I'm calling it Exploring Isn't Committing. Now, before I dive into that, what I want to say is we have these desires in our heart that are placed in our heart, right? And these desires that we have in our heart may not align with what we're doing right now. In fact, it might look very different from what we are doing right now. And it can be scary when we decide to pursue a desire if it doesn't feel the same as it is right now. It's an identity piece, basically. How we operate right now, the decisions we make, the actions we take come from an identity piece. And when you are wanting to explore something that's very different from what you're thinking of right now, or who you feel like you are, or the decisions you're making now, there can be this incongruency. I think that's a word. That can be that it just doesn't mix up, and that could be scary. And then you have, one or two things. You can go forward with it anyways, knowing it's scary, or two, you can reject it and not follow those desires, right? But one of the things that I'm realizing is we have desires in our heart for a reason. And when we don't follow those desires, we not only deny ourselves from evolving, but we deny others from that evolution. We have these gifts, and when we don't use these gifts, when we don't step into these gifts, we're denying other people receiving them. From a collective energy and a collective standpoint, and we look at this with even human design, each person has a role to facilitate in the growth of humanity. And when we don't step into this role, then we're denying helping other people. We are working together, even all the different design types all works together to support each other. And so when we're not honoring our own design type, when we're not honoring our gifts, when we're not honoring our energy, then other people can't get where they need to go, because we're almost like that missing piece for them, which is how I look at it. So by us leaning into our desires, not only are we evolving ourselves, we're helping to evolve humanity and just the collective in general. And so I understand what it's like to have that conflict of, okay, this is who I think I am. These are the decisions that I make, but I have these other desires, and that feels really scary because it's not who I thought I was, or it doesn't fit into the mold of who I think I am, right? And I'll give you an example of that is me being a speech therapist. And I said this in the very, very first episode. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, where I talk about how I am a speech therapist, but it's a separate entity, and so I'm not going to be talking about it much. I said those words, and what I've realized since then, this is what episode, I don't know actually when this episode will air, but if I'm going to air it the way in the timing of I'm recording it, this will be episode 7. So 7 episodes in, I'm now having a change of heart because I've done so much work on myself, right? But this identity piece, right? So especially if it's something that's so deeply rooted into who you think you are. And then for me, so being a speech therapist, right? And years ago, I realized I had some really solid gifts when it came to helping other people, from a healing standpoint. And there was this conflict between, okay, well, wait a minute, I'm a speech therapist, but there's also this healing piece, and I had a really hard time figuring out how to navigate that. So I get it, right? I get when you have these desires and it feels scary to pursue them, but you have these desires for a reason. And so 3 or 4 years ago, I'm going to back up a little bit. 3 or 4 years ago, probably more 4-ish years ago, I was working with a bunch of different light workers and energy healers, and there was a time where they didn't know each other, or they didn't know I was seeing each other, but it was a time where the message was always the same. And that was, I'm a healer. I am here to assist in the collective energy. And then that came from, 3 people, 4 actually, at around that same time. And I felt it too. I felt like there was something changing within me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. It just felt this shift. Things just felt different, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And at around that time, this is probably 4 years ago. Yeah, this was 4 years ago. My daughter was having a really hard time. We had put her in a private school, and the private school just wasn't a good fit for her for a lot of different reasons. So I think it was in April, I pulled her out. She had like 6 weeks left of school, and I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to homeschool you for the rest of the 6 weeks. And honestly, that homeschool was more like nervous system regulation. Like, let's just get you back to feeling safe again. Like, she was in 3rd grade. She was young. Let's get you feeling back safe again, and knowing that, you're okay, and we'll just do that. We didn't necessarily work on the academic piece. There was some academics, but it was more just emotional support and nervous system regulation, because it was a doozy of a year for her. And I ended up working with this energy worker. His name is Paul Ditscheit, and he owns Soul Awareness Healing. I think it's like Soul Awareness Healing. I'll put it in the notes, so if you want to look into it. But it was recommended for me to work with him by another light worker that I had been working with, who was trained under him. And she said, just give him a call and he can help. So basically, my daughter was having a lot of anxiety and nightmares and just anxiousness and depression, and because of the school year. And so I had called him, and we had a session together. And at that time, we had 2 sessions. The second session, he was leading 2 other practitioners who he was training, and he had asked ahead of time if this call could be done during his training. So then the 2 practitioners that he's training on this approach, or this, modality, will have like a real life, session. And of course, me, always wanting to educate and learn more, I'm like, absolutely, let's do this. And I was sitting in my car in the garage during this session, and my daughter was home, and so I'm just going to go to the car. I didn't want to be distracted. And so one of the things that I started to do as we were like tapping into this energy was I was moving my body in a really strange way. Like, my head was moving. The only way I can describe it was like moving in a figure 8. The way that my head was just like, bobbing side to side, and my mind, it was like moving through the wave of a figure 8. And I've since realized that, like, when I am channeling energy, my body does move. So this is, I didn't know this at the time, but this is kind of like what my body does. But it was specifically my head moving through a figure 8. And I felt there were other things that I was experiencing as well, like when we were channeling her soul. And basically, essentially what you do is like you kind of channel the soul, and then you transmute any heaviness around there, and then you add more light to it. That's just like such a simple explanation, and I don't really know more than that, although as you'll find out very soon, I could have. And so I was, at one point I said to him, I'm like, can I tell you something what's happening on my end over here? Because it's over the phone, he couldn't see me. I'm like, this has never happened to me before, but my head is moving, and the only way I can describe it is like in a figure 8 pattern. It was just moving side to side, but like the way it was, like the flow of the movement was like a figure 8 pattern. And he said, that's really interesting. I actually get my students to draw figure 8s on the floor with their finger to get themselves into like that state, whatever that state is, like the theta state, trance, like whatever, I'm not quite sure. I'm like, huh. So we go through the sessions, and at the end, he's like, you are so intuitive, and you knew exactly what to do. I would love to invite you to get this training. He's like, I don't invite a lot of people. People actually find me, but I would love to invite you to get this training. And at the time, I was like, I feel so honored. This is really cool. And I'm like, yeah, I'll think about it. And then the conversation stopped. Like, I did not pursue, I didn't call, I didn't follow up or anything. I got so scared to do that, because I'm like, what does that mean? I'm a speech therapist, but yet I'm going to get training in this approach. And this is before I got trained in Reiki. But at the time I was struggling big time. Like, what does that mean? Like, I want to get trained in this approach, but yet I'm a speech therapist. Like, what would my husband think of this? Like, this is so strange. And so I just shut it down. I shut it down, and I was shutting a part of that desire, right? I even felt it. Like, I wanted to learn more. Like, I felt such a yearning to like lean into this space, lean into this energy world. And of course, this is way before Reiki and way before human design. But I just had like this calling, and it was the same calling that the other energy workers were picking up when they were working with me. Like, I am a healer, and I was called to expand upon that healing, the modalities, but it freaked me out. And then I was with a friend of mine who was a life coach, and I had a session with her, and so I brought this up, and she's like, well, why, what are you afraid of? Like, why don't you want to do it? And I'm like, I just don't even know what my husband would think about it. Like, I don't know. Like, this is such a strange thing. Like, I'm a speech therapist, And again, this whole speech therapy piece and the identity with it. I have so much to say about this identity piece, that we associate ourselves with an identity, that we block ourselves off from exploring anything more because we're living based on what we think we should live, or how we should live, or as opposed to what feels good to us, right? I have so much to say on this, but anyways, that's a different episode. So, and she said, well, Karen, first she said, well, how long is the program? I'm like, I don't know. She's like, well, do you know how much it costs? I'm like, no, I don't know. I literally shut down the conversation. And she said to me, and this has been a game changer for me, for any of my desires that come to me, a game changer. She's like, Karen, exploring isn't committing. Exploring, get more information, getting answers isn't committing. Like, get the information and then make a decision based on that. Don't necessarily shut it off in the beginning, especially like if it feels scary to you. Like, don't just shut it off. Like, get some more information. And that was huge for me. Like I said, that was like a game changing moment. And so I ended up, I think a day or so later, I ended up calling Paul back and asking him tell me about the program. Like, what's the time commitment? And I can't remember at the time, but it was a lot. Like, I think it was like 2 weekends in a row you would go, and then you wait a few more months and you come back again, or something like that. And where it was like on site, and where he worked was, a couple hours away from where I lived. I mean, it was just something that wasn't convenient timing wise. And then the financial investment just wasn't something I was aligned to at the time either. And so I'm like, okay, well, let me think about it. And then I called him back afterwards, and I said, I just don't think the timing of it is right for me right now, but I'll let you know if that changes. And that felt so much better, so much more empowering to me to make that decision from an informed decision, and not necessarily make a decision based on what I think should be or shouldn't be, right? And so what I want to say to you, and the point of this podcast today, is to give yourself permission to explore. If there are things that you have this desire, if there are things that you're wanting to learn more, if there's things that you're curious about, but it doesn't fit an identity of who you think you are, that you shouldn't be someone that should pursue that, just dip your toe into it. Start asking questions, explore. It might not be something that feels right, but it might be something that feels incredibly awesome that you want to pursue. And so exploring isn't committing. I think there's a lot of people, including me, who feel that once we start, especially if you're like, an all or none person, which I can be like that, then when you start exploring, it's like, okay, I'm going all in, right? Like, oh, human design, I'm going all in, I'm getting certified, right? So, oh, Reiki, I love it. I'm going to go get trained in it. And so I have this, I think it's this 6-3 in me, and also the incarnation cross of education, that it's this desire to just learn more. And so when we are following our desires, it's almost like we're afraid to commit, but it doesn't have to be committing. It's just information. And it doesn't have to be aligned with you at this moment. Maybe it's aligned down the road. And so what I want you to take away is realizing that you have desires that you're meant to follow. And following doesn't mean actually committing. It just means getting some more information in it. And maybe that following that the breadcrumbs, the trail of breadcrumbs, and like exploring things, maybe that leads to something else. So it was like an indirect path to something else, right? That desire is put in your heart to like explore, but during that exploration, you found something else that you were meant to have found, but you couldn't have found it unless you started following that breadcrumb in the first place, right? So anyways, the takeaway: to follow these desires that are in your heart. They're in your heart for a reason. By you denying those desires for yourself, you are denying your gifts to other people who need them. I hope this resonates with you. If you are wanting to explore a little bit more of your desires, what's put in your heart, what your gifts are, your purpose here, part of your journey, what are you meant to heal, where are you meant to grow and evolve, I encourage you and strongly suggest a human design reading. If you haven't had a reading yet, or you've only had a basic one, or if you've only explored your chart online and read blogs, I encourage you to go to my website, KarenGalway.com, and click on Human Design Readings and just explore the different packages. Again, exploring isn't committing. Just explore the different packages and see what's available, what comes up. They're priced from $88 to $333, depending on how deep you go. And with human design, you can go super deep. I also have, I believe, on my website, Activate Intensives. And this is more so if you have a limiting belief, like a block that you're having a hard time moving through. I use human design to help with that, to help you move through it. And of course, if you're wanting to go really deep and really start this evolutionary process, this transformation of being able to shift an identity or call in who you're meant to be and like step into that role, then my 8-week one-on-one coaching, Your Life by Design, so this name of the same podcast, might be something for you as well. So just poke around there and see if anything that speaks to you. Thank you so much for taking time and tuning into today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new. I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.